and welcome. I'm Stephanie St. Combe. Founded in 1984 by Miami Dade College and community partners, the Miami Book Fair is an 8-day literary party with more than 450 authors from the United States and around the world. Due to the pandemic, this year's events will go virtual. Moreover, all events will be free and for all ages. You can watch your favorite author from the comfort of your own home. All you need to do is visit miamibookfaironline.com. There, you can register to watch via online videos, book presentations by their respective authors. This year's event begins on Sunday, November 15th, and will run until Sunday, November 22nd. Remember to visit miamibookfaironline.com to register. My first guest is presenting a book that showcases the stories of those explorers and adventurers who helped open the unique environment of South Florida to the world. With the book titled Seeking the American Tropics, South Florida's Early Naturalists. I'm joined via Zoom by its author, ornithologist, and conservationist, Dr. James A. Kuslan. Welcome, Dr. Kuslan.
Oh, glad to be here, Stephanie.
How did the love for nature, and specifically birds, come about?
Oh, it started really early. I grew up in West Little River, and one side of my house was the Little River Canal. And so I spent my childhood just boating up and down the canal, discovering what was there, alligators and manatees and giant prawns with big long claws and so forth. But didn't really know anything. It was just kind of experiencing it. I didn't know anything because back then, and we're talking about the 50s now, we didn't teach science in elementary school. So it wasn't till high school that I hit a biology course, and it's like, oh, now I know what I'm supposed to do with my life. So it goes way, way back, and then becomes more and more complicated as you get this degree and that degree and become a biologist.
You're a native Miamian, and you've traveled all around the world. I want to know, what about South Florida? What the discoveries that you made so unique? What sets South Florida apart, if you will?
Sure. I talk about this a lot in all my writings, and it kind of is a fundamental understanding of South Florida. And from a biological point of view, it's a piece of the tropics, just stuck on to temperate North America. So we've got this mixture of North American plants and animals and West Indian plants and animals, and there's no other place like that. And so this tropical aspect is what makes South Florida unique. And really, that's what brought, relative to this book, that's what brought all these naturalists down to South Florida to figure out what was here.
As an ornithologist, how important is the relation of the environment to the avian community?
Well, overall, I mean, it provides habitat. And one thing we spend a lot of time doing is trying to help people recreate habitat in their backyard for birds. But probably the more interesting fundamental issue has to do with the birds that I've studied, the herons and storks and ibises in the Everglades. And the environment is absolutely crucial for them because seasonally the water levels go up and down. And if that seasonal fluctuation of water level doesn't happen, they can't nest successfully. And that's been one of the difficulties over the last 50 years in the Everglades, is that the water levels have been manipulated. So it's really just a one-to-one relationship between what's happening in the environment and the ability of these birds to nest successfully.
You've written several books that deal with Florida's history and also about birds. What made you decide to write this book about South Florida?
This book goes back a long ways as well. When I first started studying South Florida, doing my research here, that was the late 60s, early 70s. And the literature at that point was from people who had written in the 20s and 30s and teens. We didn't know nearly as much as we know now about South Florida. So these early naturalists were people I studied. And then as I came to learn more and more about the Everglades, I came to appreciate more all the people who had come before and helped us understand what South Florida is all about. So I decided to write their stories, and I actually decided to just pick a half a dozen and tell their stories, and it just didn't work out that way because it turns out there are dozens and dozens of people over hundreds of years that have helped us understand South Florida. And so that's what the book became. It's the stories of dozens and dozens of people over a long period of time.
And what do you think readers will get out of this book?
Well, hopefully an appreciation that there's a history here. You mentioned that some people have been here longer than others, and as you arrive to a new place, it takes a long time to get a sense of that place and to understand, because your history begins when you arrive. When in fact, South Florida was the second landing place of Ponce de Leon in 1513. He landed on Key Biscayne. And so our history goes back a long, long way. And it takes some time and effort in order to fully appreciate that the ground you're standing on may be a Tequesta Indian mound or a place where early pioneers lived, or, like many of us, used to be Everglades, because half of the Everglades is now drained and people are living on it. So the sense of history, the sense of how Florida history fits into the sweep of history in North America, and hopefully they'll get out an appreciation of just how deeply people were committed to trying to determine what's happening in South Florida. And some of these early naturalists died in the process. So it's a deep and interesting and broad story, and hopefully people will come to understand their history a little better.
Besides being a scientist, you're also an educator. Do you think that the new generation cares about the environment and its habitat?
I certainly hope so. The last chapter of the book, I talk about the interaction between naturalists, the scientists who are out there, and conservationists. And the conservation movement in South Florida began just about 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And it wasn't the naturalist that did it. It wasn't the scientist. It was the women's clubs and the Audubon societies that started the conservation of South Florida. And I think that's a welcome story, because you don't have to rely on government. Each individual can have an effect. Social justice, economic justice, environmental justice are all intimately connected. So I'm certainly hopeful that the current generation, new generations, will take it seriously, because the environmental degradation we're facing is very serious.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuslan.
You're very welcome.
We're taking our first break. When we come back, we'll talk with the author of another South Florida pioneer. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The Extraordinary Life of Jane Wood Reno, Miami's trailblazing journalist, is a story about the great journalist, activist, and adventurer James Wood Reno. The story is written by her grandson, writer George Hurchulla. He joins me now via Zoom. Hello, George.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. Your late grandmother is not only remembered as the reporter for Miami News and as the wife of the late Henry Reno, also a reporter, but for the Miami Herald, do you think you got the writing bug from them?
I think probably so. I didn't realize it till a bit later in life, but the more I looked into my grandmother's life, the more I realized I followed in her footsteps in a lot of ways that, I had not been aware of at the time. Her getting a physics degree, but becoming a journalist. I got an engineering degree, but never actually did anything with engineering and preferred writing.
Wow. Wow, that's similar paths that you guys took, and you said you didn't even know that.
Yeah, at the time, I had no idea.
before being a writer, you were a punk DJ, right?
Yes.
And a photographer for several newspapers. How did you do the transition?
Well, I was a writer throughout my life, so that was always there. I never seriously pursued it till later on. It was always a part of my life, but I just balanced a whole variety of interests throughout. Mainly just the love of adventure carrying me through all of it.
And not only your grandparents are famous in their own rights, but your aunt was another important person, not only to South Florida, but also for the United States. The late U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno. Can you tell us, how do you feel about being part of such an important family?
Oh, it's been an absolutely wonderful experience. I've just been surrounded by just larger than life figures throughout my life. From my grandmother to my aunt, my mother, my uncles, all of them were towering figures in their own way, just brilliant intellects, adventurous people, kind, compassionate people, just really interesting people to be around all the time.
And this is not your first book, and also not the first book that you've written about your grandmother. Why did you decide to do another book about her?
The original book was a collection of her journalism that I edited, so there was a small amount of my writing in it, but it was mainly just her stories, and it was kind of an incomplete view of her life and even an incomplete view of her journalism. And it sort of piqued my interest more about her entire life the more I learned about it in that book. And I felt that as good as her journalism was, her personal story was that much more riveting and interesting even than her journalism was. And I really wanted to tell her personal story of her whole life.
Can you give us a few details without giving too much away? Like some stories that we'll find out?
Oh, about her life?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the most interesting discoveries in the book, after I'd written a certain amount of it, is none of her children knew much about her life before they were born. They had a loose timeline of, they knew the sort of story that she dropped out of the University of Miami. She'd gone to Greece for a year or two. They weren't quite sure the timeline of what she'd done during the Depression as a reporter and social worker and going back to university. None of them just really knew that much about her life during the Depression. And so I always thought, well, researching the book, it'd be nice if I could just find one letter from her in Greece to give me an idea what she was doing there. And so I was combing around the family attic, which we played in as kids, climbed up into the attic in the house and looking through old newspapers and papers up there. And I found, amidst an old pile of papers, I found this handwritten scrawl that appeared to be a letter. And then I dug through it and found one more letter. And eventually I found 34 letters from Greece in 1931. And that just opened up a whole new chapter of her life and adventures to me as a teenager.
Are we going to find out stories about sweaters for snakes, alligator wrestling, and in the book? Like, are we going to see some of that stuff?
Yeah. The snakes need sweaters story is actually one that unfortunately never quite made it. It was always in the back of my mind, but I never quite knew the entire story. It was just a family story I'd heard 100 times, but it was something that slipped my mind to actually include in the book in the end. But yes, we'll learn about her alligator wrestling and being bitten on the finger by the alligator that she was shipping to the Baltimore Zoo and other entertaining stories like that.
Well, George Hurchulla, thank you so much. You and your family have contributed so much and advocated for people who couldn't do much for themselves, and for that we thank you, and we thank you for this interview.
Thank you, Stephanie.
We're taking our second break. When we come back, we'll talk to the author of a Florida artist who created a movement in local painting. Don't go away. Welcome back. Alfred Hare, Heart of the Highwaymen, is about an African-American artist from Fort Pierce who started a movement. I'm joined by its author, photographer, and retired professor, Gary Monroe. Hello, Gary.
Stephanie, hi.
Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
For those folks at home who don't know about the rich history of the Highwaymen, can you tell us more about them and who was their mentor?
Yeah, gladly. The Highwaymen were unnamed during their tenure between about 1960 and 1980. During that time, early on, they created their own form of landscape painting. They borrowed from the white regionalist A.E. Backus in Fort Pierce, where they all lived. And they went about corrupting the cherished standards that Backus, a white painter, used very successfully commercially. And they painted fast because Alfred Hare, the ringleader, wanted to be a millionaire by his 35th birthday, a pretty lofty dream for a young black man living in Fort Pierce, where one social destiny seemed to be working in the orange groves or tomato fields and packing houses. But he had a remarkable personality, rather charismatic, very good looking. And he studied painting in high school with Backus on Saturday mornings, kids' classes. And then he, being magnanimous of spirit, when he graduated, he invited his friends to join him, taught them the techniques that he had learned from Backus. But because he wanted to make money more than art, he painted very quickly and invariably changing the formulas and establishing a fresher interpretation of the Florida landscape. And he and his cohort went about selling these to a white clientele up and down the east coast of Florida for $25 a piece, affordable, whereas Backus's paintings were $250 a piece. So they had to paint and sell 10 of them in the same time. It took Backus to paint one to make the same money. So by painting fast, they invented their own form of imagery that seemed to catch on to post-war Americans that were flocking to Florida.
You have written other books about the Highwaymen. Why did you think it was very important to talk about them?
Now I'm a working artist from Miami and I'm native Floridian, born in Miami Beach, and have a master's in fine arts, do my own work. And I just I was photographing self-taught artists when in 1997, a gallerist named Jim Fitch in Sebring stumbled upon these painters. They were nameless during their run, and he named them the Highwaymen, and suddenly they were commodified. And people took interest, a couple of articles appeared, and I'd heard about the story and went to meet three of the artists, and I was blown away with the tale as well as the artwork, and just compelled to know more and and being hyperactive. I started to write about them, and it became a book for the University Press of Florida. And that book spawned 5 more. The 5th one is the one we're talking about now, Alfred Hare, the Highwayman. He was without a doubt the ringleader, the most creative painter, and the man responsible, essentially, for leaving the visual legacy of modern Florida. They didn't keep inventories or sales records, but it's estimated they painted a solid 200,000 oil paintings during their run. Not quite sure if it's that high or half of that, but even if it's half of that, it's a lot of oil paintings. And one of the most adamant collectors thinks it's 250,000 paintings. But nevertheless, there's the lasting testimony to Florida as we remember.
We're out of time. Thank you so much for speaking with us about the Highwaymen. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. I said my pleasure.
Thank you. We're taking another break, and when we come back, we'll be talking to another author who wrote about a very influential Miami journalist. Don't go away. Welcome back. What does it take to be the editor of a newspaper? In her book, A Nervous Man Shouldn't Be Here in the First Place, The Life of Bill Baggs tries to explore that. Joining me via Zoom is its author, award-winning freelance writer, Amy Paige Condon. Hello and welcome, Amy.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you for inviting me here today.
Thank you for being with us. You have quite a story, and you went from being an urban planner to a creative writer. Can you tell us how that happened?
Sure. I think being a planner was an accidental profession for me because I had started out as a journalist, but I wanted to learn more about how policies were made and how decisions were made, budgets prioritized. And so I went to graduate school in urban and public affairs at the University of Texas at Arlington. And I got an internship in the Miami-Dade County Manager's Office, a one-year internship after finishing all my coursework at UTA. And I thought I was going to be in Miami for a year. And I ended up staying 16 because I kind of fell in love with the city. And I also fell in love with planning. I started working in the planning and research division of the Miami-Dade Park and Recreation Department and just loved it. Worked on bond referendums, worked on community planning, loved every moment of it, conservation issues. And then I had always taken at Miami Dade College. I'd been taking a lot of the creative writing classes that were offered at night, and finally kind of went back to the idea that the thing I wanted to do most was write, and I better start doing it before it got away from me. And there was a story I wanted to tell, and it was definitely the Bill Baggs story.
You have co-written various cookbooks.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you decide to change the recipe and write a biography?
Well, strangely, there's a lot in common between cookbooks and biographies, because cookbooks are really compendiums, not just of recipes, but of a person's life story or their philosophy behind the way that they cook. And food is such a sensual type of writing. It's about what you see, what you smell, what you taste. And so it was a great proving ground for wanting to write this biography. I'd had in my head that Bill's story would make such a great book. And I'd had this idea since 2007 or even earlier. But I never really had the confidence to pursue it until I actually had a couple of cookbooks under my belt and partnering with some wonderful, wonderful chefs here in Savannah. One of them, Cheryl and Griffith Day, who have Back in the Day Bakery, and Wiley's Championship Barbecue, which was Wiley McCreary. And getting to know their stories and sort of getting into the research and verification and just the discipline of developing those cookbooks helped me know what I needed to do to actually work on Bill's story, because I had to be somewhat of a private investigator. He died in 1969. And so there were his papers at the University of Miami Special Collections, but I needed to go into the city, the little town that he grew up in here in Georgia, Colquitt, Georgia, on the Alabama border. I needed to sort of retrace his steps and figure out what his life was like and how he became the person that he became. And so it wasn't so much as changing a recipe as just expanding it and throwing in some different ingredients.
I watched your TED Talk, and it was extremely moving, I have to say. Could you go into about what got Bill Baggs involved in this movement?
Sure. So Bill Baggs grew up in a Jim Crow South where there were the black codes, where he witnessed a lynching as a young man. And it really shaped how he thought about the world. Then he went to Panama And when he was in Panama, right after high school graduation, he worked at the Panama Star and Herald. He worked as a stevedore down on the docks. And he was basically in an area that was so multicultural and so different than how he grew up, that he learned Spanish. He learned how to exist and to make friends and to celebrate diversity. And then he fought in World War II. He was a bombardier on B-24s that flew out of Venosa, Italy. And then during R&R, which is rest and reassignment, he was reassigned to Miami Beach for 12 weeks. And there he absolutely fell in love with the city. And that was at a time that, Miami was not even 50 years old as a city and was still a bit of a frontier town to some respects, but it was going through cataclysmic change because of the war. And after the war, he went back to Georgia, worked at a newspaper in North Carolina for a little while, and then wrote a letter to the managing editor of the Miami News asking, sort of desperately for a job because he wanted to get back to Miami. He wanted to be near water. So he drove down, introduced himself to a man named Hoke Welch, which is such a great name, Hoke Welch, and had this wonderful experience where they said, we'll make room for you. We'll make you the aviation reporter, because Miami at that time was the first city to actually have an aviation director in the United States. And it was, sort of at the forefront of commercial aviation. So he just arrived at the right time and at the right place, but almost immediately started writing about labor issues and about transportation issues. And as he was writing about those things, he was confronting the challenges that Miami, as far from Colquitt, Georgia, and as far from where he grew up, it was still very much a Southern town. And he recognized that the housing policies were discriminatory and that the Black citizens in Miami did not have the fullness of economic and social and cultural life. So he started writing about these issues, and he ended up getting his own column, and he would just hammer those issues constantly. And when the Brown versus the Board of Education decision came down, he was one of the first to really write about the time has come to desegregate education. He felt like, he absolutely believed that education was the key to
integrating public schools at that time. He was definitely ahead of his time. That was a very unpopular
subject. He got death threats for it.
Yes. We have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for speaking with us and telling us about Bill Baggs and the amazing things that he advocated for, the amazing things he stood for, and how he gave love when people gave him hate, when he stood for those issues. And thank you so much for bringing this to light. And as he said, and as you have said, this is not a simple world, and there are no simple questions. There are no simple answers. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So grab a coffee.
This is all for this show. Remember that due to the pandemic, this year's events will go virtual. Moreover, all events will be free and for all ages. All you need to do is visit MiamiBookFairOnline.com. There, you can register to watch via online videos, book presentations by the respective authors. Remember to visit MiamiBookFairOnline.com to register. I'm Stephanie St. Cone. Until next time, have a great day.